I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a stunning new study ranking the 8 greatest national powers for 2017. The study is published by a bi-monthly neoconservative foreign policy magazine entitled The American Interest, whose contributors include France's leading intellectual Bernard-Henri Lévy, political commentator and former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, foreign affairs author Robert David Kaplan, and foreign policy professor Walter Russell Mead, formerly at Yale, now at Bard, who is one of the chief authors of the study on today's 8 great world powers. And can you list the 8 in order? The 8 great world powers. The first is easy, of course, the United States. The next 2 are tied for second, third place. Which countries are the second and third world powers today? If you said China and Japan, you would be in agreement with the American Interest study. What about number 4? Behind China and Japan. This country was 5th last year, but jumped into 4th place this year. The answer is Russia. Russia is now the 4th greatest power in the world, and Russia leapfrogged Germany, which fell from 4th to 5th place. So you have the top 5. Okay, 6th, India is ranked the 6th greatest world power today. Now the 7th really surprised me. Which do you think the 7th greatest world power is today? According to the American Interest, it is Iran. Iran. Thanks to the Iran nuclear deal, the lifting of economic sanctions has elevated Iran's power in the Middle East, becoming more dominant in the region than even Saudi Arabia. Its high-profile deals with Boeing and Airbus elevated its stature, and it's rapidly drawing business opportunities from everywhere while it continues to export terrorism and to strengthen Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's even gaining ground, the study says, on Iraq. So Iran is now among the top 8 great powers of the world, ranking number 7. And that only leaves one more nation in the top 8. And lo and behold, surprise of surprises, according to the study produced by the American Interest, for the first time in its 69-year history, Israel now ranks among the top world powers of our time. Little, tiny Israel. On the same list with such international giants as the United States, China, Japan, Russia, Germany, India, and Iran. And then Israel, with a land mass and a population minuscule in comparison with the other 7 world powers. Yet Israel is now recognized as one of the 8 great powers in the world. To me, this is no small story. While so much of the world is critical of Israel, describing it in vile ways that have no bearing on any truth at all, while the EU is pushing Palestinian statehood, while the UN is passing Security Council resolutions charging that Israel is guilty of flagrant violations of international law, while the far left, Black Lives Matter, and a hateful, racist BDS movement is claiming that Israel has no legitimate right to exist. In the midst of all this, little Israel climbed its way up to its being the 8th most powerful country in the world. And why? What about Israel makes it the 8th most powerful country of 2017? For some answers, I'm so pleased to be joined on our JBS phones from Washington, D.C., by an individual who helped with the study for the American Interest, Harry Zev Cohn, who presently works as a research associate at the conservative nonprofit think tank, the Hudson Institute. He joins us on Skype. Harry, thank you so much for giving us some time here on JBS.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Harry, first of all, did I describe both American Interest and the study fairly accurately?
Yes, although I should probably say that there are people who work for the American Interest who would be uncomfortable with, being characterized as a neoconservative publication. And so in order to not get in trouble with my bosses, I need to just say that on the air. But we do obviously publish many neoconservative writers. And,
okay.
But otherwise, yes, I think you characterized us quite right.
Okay. So, but before I ask you to comment on your work on the study and how you read it, what it means to you, and what it should mean for us, who in the world are you, Harry? How do you become a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, and where'd you go to school? First of all, you're a Jewish kid. Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Went to high school on the Lower East Side, though, in Manhattan. So I sort of had
which one?
Friends Seminary. And so I grew up around a lot of progressive activism, around Israel, and sort of felt that and know that very well. And then I went to, it's somewhat embarrassing to say after last week's news, but Middlebury College, where I also saw a fair amount of anti-Israel activism. But I have to say, when I was there, I graduated almost 2 years ago, and when I was there, it really was not. I am shocked by what happened last week by the protests, and it was a much calmer place. Yes. Most students there wanted to get ahead and knew you don't get ahead by taking it to the streets. Something in this country and on that campus has changed. So that's me. And now I work at the Hudson Institute with Walter Russell Mead. I'm a research associate here for him. I'm helping him with his book on the history of the United States and Israel and the relationship between the two. And, yeah.
How do you now define yourself on the political spectrum?
These days, it's hard. I think the left, quite frankly, has a hard time. It's very hard to be a straight white Jewish male on the left these days. Because I think it's very hard to be a supporter of Israel and be on the left among young people. I think this is probably not as true among older people. I have a lot of older liberal friends who I share more in common with politically, but amongst younger people, it's more difficult. It's also more difficult to have serious conversations among younger liberals. Many of them have a hard, there's a sort of totalitarian approach to free speech on these campuses. So if you're interested in free speech and open inquiry, it's hard to define yourself as being left wing. Does that mean that I'm particularly right wing? I don't know. I suppose some might say it does. Hudson certainly is. And as you said, the American Interest publishes many right-wing authors. But, I think Walter and I and most of us at the American Interest don't think of ourselves as particularly partisan, where we try to be sort of independent and centrist and moderate, and mostly just to get things right. And if that means we fall on one side or the other, great.
Yes. By the way, maybe you'll disagree with me. I don't think Robert Reich is normally considered to be on the right. He's a real hard-lying someone on the left.
That's right.
Bernard-Henri Lévy out of France is not normally associated with the right. So it seems to me you have a balance, and that I'm not talking about the Hudson Institute, but the American Interest has a balance, and it's nice that you work there. You're a very articulate young man, and I'm very pleased to have you on, and I thank you for making time. So then, how did you come to work with Walter Russell Mead, and Sean Keeley's name is also on the document, working on this report on the 8 great powers of 2017, and you told me off camera you worked with him as well on 2016, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So Walter publishes this. He's published, I guess this is the 3rd year in a row he's published this list, maybe the 4th now. And, countries go up and down, and it's proven to be a popular sort of article for us. It gets a lot of views. A lot of people are interested. When we put Saudi Arabia on the list a couple of years ago for the next year, in fact, to this day, we still get, sometimes get, random bursts of thousands of views for that article from Saudi Arabia. People are really interested in reading about their countries and its relative power. So I was involved in it last year, and then I was involved this year. I didn't actually write the article this year, but I was involved in the discussions about it with Walter and with Sean.
Okay. So you saw Israel make the list for the first time. Coincidentally, you care about Israel. As this happened, as you heard the discussion begin, and you're now realizing, whoa, Israel will make the top 8. What went through your head? What went through your? What did you feel? What were you thinking about?
Well, I have to say, my first reaction was sort of skepticism when I think it was Walter first suggested we put it on there, and we sort of looked around in an editorial meeting, and I didn't really. At first, I wasn't sure. I said, "Really, Israel? I mean, look, they're very powerful. They have a serious military. They have a vibrant economy and lots of intellectual talent and startup nation, all that stuff. But the idea that Israel, the GDP is still, not anywhere close to a top 10 GDP in the world. And it's a very small country, and it's hard to imagine it going head to head with other major powers.
Exactly.
But as you think about it, one of the things is I think to an extent you could argue the list is sort of it's qualified by some considerations of region, and so when you look at the Middle East, there's no doubt that the two most powerful countries right now are Iran and Israel, with Saudi Arabia not far behind. And so if Israel were in Asia, would it look as powerful? I don't know, but for the goals it has and for what it's trying to achieve on the world stage, it's been remarkably successful, and it had a really good year. Say what you want about him, and there are plenty of people who I know many people who don't like him. He is geopolitically very savvy, very smart, and he really steered the ship of Israel's state on a pretty impressive course in world affairs. Better, I think, than Obama did the U.S. By far.
Well, as I said, I find it stunning that a country as tiny as Israel would now be with such national behemoths as U.S., China, Russia, India. I looked through your piece, and there are a number of areas, number of concerns that you indicate. When I say you, the people who put out this study, indicate are the reasons why America has just felt Israel should be on the list. It begins, Harry, with the study describing the large offshore discoveries of natural gas, which, according to the paper, turned Israel into an energy power. Can you speak about that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. So, this is Israel has these massive natural gas findings in the Mediterranean, just offshore. They found in the past decade, and it's become clear in the past few years just how large these reserves are. And when you look at other countries in the Middle East, how did they get powerful? Why is the UAE such a powerful? Well, it's so powerful because it has oil. And so Israel has never had oil. It's always been an energy importer, and that's a big strategic liability for a country surrounded by, let's just say, not surrounded by allies or even neutral powers necessarily. And now all of a sudden, Israel has this major strategic asset. This is I don't have the numbers offhand, but it's these are some of the largest natural gas findings in the world in the last several decades. There are questions about whether Israel will be able to develop them and how quickly. It's been tied up in courts, but assuming that those hurdles are cleared, this is a big deal.
And your paper also talks about how Turkey now turns to Israel for its energy, and the whole tie between Israel and Turkey is much closer now.
Yeah, that's right. So if you remember a few years ago, the Mavi Marmara, incident.
Absolutely.
Where the ship, came, with people trying to get to Gaza, and Israel, Israeli forces boarded the ship, and it was a sort of it was an international crisis. It didn't look good on TV for Israel. Israel had a hard time, and Turkey, Erdogan, he publicly rebuked Israel, and relations deteriorated substantially. If you look at what's happened over the past few years, almost all of that is reversed, and this is simultaneously. At the same time, Turkey is becoming much more Islamist, much more sort of hardline. And I think this speaks to an extent to what Netanyahu actually understands about the state of the world right now. And again, this isn't necessarily an endorsement of this reality, or many people, I suspect, many of your viewers will, this will sound unpleasant to them, but authoritarians are doing well right now. They understand something about hard power that I think a lot of democratic leaders and more liberal-minded leaders have forgotten. And we are in a world in which statesmen like Erdogan and Putin are running circles around, we're running circles around statesmen like Obama, but, Merkel, Hollande in France. If you look at what happened to even David Cameron in the UK, I mean, many Western leaders didn't see what was coming. Netanyahu did, and he has built up and improved ties with countries like Turkey, countries like Russia, countries like China to some extent, certainly with Japan, with India, because he's understood something about hard power and how it works in 2017 that a lot of people in the West, I think, are willfully, or until recently were willfully ignoring.
The study also talks about Israel's strength in domestic cybersecurity, which I found so interesting. Any comment?
Yeah, so this has been a big priority of Netanyahu's and of the Israeli government's. They realize they have a huge advantage in technology. There's the startup nation stuff. Israel has all of these startups in the tech space, and many engineers and people who really understand, cyber technology. And they also have many people who are experts in cybersecurity. And over the last decade or so, cybersecurity has become probably the most important and the fastest changing part of security around the world, and Israel sees an opportunity there. So they're lifting regulations. They're taking steps that can encourage companies to start and form in Israel that look at how do we protect data, how do we protect assets in far-flung places. How can corporations and businesses stay safe? There are a lot of companies in Israel right now that are trying to figure this out, and the Israeli government is with them 100%.
Marvelous. So we see energy, we see cybersecurity, and there's also a discussion in the paper about Israel's work with irrigation, desalination, dry land farming, which the paper argues has helped Israel build incredible ties with Africa and India. Speak about that for a moment.
Yeah, so you have these places in the world where populations are growing very quickly, where natural resources are in short supply. China also has a lot of water issues. Beijing is probably headed towards some sort of water crisis, many people think, sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, not sooner. You look at the smog, all sorts of areas. Israel has a lot of experience doing a lot with very little. They, recycle, some estimates, upwards of 70% of their water for, many purposes. Their irrigation technology has long been sort of industry leading and used around the world. And in an environment in which, like Africa or China or India, where you have, desert and places where, for other reasons, resources are scarce, Israel has a lot of solutions. And what you're seeing is, despite, some international condemnation and concern about Israel, most of these countries are still willing to do business.
Exactly.
Stopping.
Exactly. And that was what was so fascinating to me about your study. On the ground, people really are very happy to be working with Israel, despite what officials may say in public arenas. Fascinating. Then that was one whole area. Your second area, in which the paper suggests Israel has made major strides, pushing it up into the 8th position, is that Israel is described in your paper as a kingmaker, and your paper says the following: the Middle Eastern balance of power has transformed Israel from a pariah state to a kingmaker. And it talks about how, as Syria has gotten weaker, Israel's military strength is more and more important, and that as ISIS is a threat not simply to the West, but to Arab nations as well, including Egypt, there is greater and greater security cooperation between Israel and other Islamic Arab nations. Speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, well, look, if you're a world leader, the most important thing for you when you're forming alliances, probably is consistency and stability of the people you're trying to form alliances with. And Israel is not just, long been called an island of democracy in the Middle East. It's an island of stability in a very unstable region. And so if you are Saudi Arabia, you know that Israel is going to probably, remain committed to the positions that it holds and have similar interests in 5 years or 10 years. It's not going to, erupt in some sort of revolution. And you're looking around the region and you can't really say that with much confidence about most of the other countries. So many countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan to some extent, are looking at Israel and saying, we might have deep ideological disagreements, and our populations might be very concerned about Israel and very angry at Israel and very pro-Palestinian. But when it comes to geopolitics, we need to make some kind of deals. And so you first started to see this behind the scenes. The Saudis were meeting with Israelis sort of on the sidelines of major conferences and things, and this would leak out into the press. And then it went public sometime in the last really year and a half that the Saudis and the Israelis are working together. And why is that? It's really simple. It's Iran. It's because the Saudis are concerned that the balance of power has shifted from a Sunni majority or a Sunni heavy power balance in the Middle East to a Shia heavy, and that is in large part because as President Obama, I think, would openly admit it, has openly admitted, because that was the goal of the Iran deal, was to restore some sort of balance. And that freaked the Saudis out, and obviously it freaked the Israelis out, and they're finding common ground over it.
It's amazing. All right, I'm rushing through, but the third area, a whole section, was Israel's relationship now with Russia. And of course, here in the United States, Trump, Russia, U.S., Russia, Obama, big deal. But in your paper, it comes at it from a different perspective. Talk for one moment about why Israel is elevated to number 8, in part because of its relationship now with Russia.
Yeah, so Bibi and Putin met, I think, something like, Bibi and Obama met 1 or 2 times last year, and Bibi and Putin met, I think, upwards of 5. I can't quite remember, but so they're building a stronger relationship. Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister in Israel, is a Russian Jew. He has connections to Russia. I think one of the things you're seeing is that the Israeli population is becoming more Russian, and Russian Israelis are gaining more prominence, and that's leading to sort of a shared sensibility. Obviously, Russian Jews don't necessarily have the warmest feelings towards Russia. Russia didn't treat them particularly well, but nevertheless, there's a shared sensibility about how power works, about how the world works. That's helping Bibi, that's pushing him, and that's and also this sense that Bibi has that in geopolitics in 2017, you need to make common cause with whomever you can, especially if you're a state like Israel. And also that the West really doesn't get it. They don't understand a lot of the forces of nationalism and sort of hard power that are making a comeback. And Putin does, and he's a useful ally for Israel. I don't think relationship is that close, but it's a very convenient one and a very helpful one for a small country.
Okay. There you have the 3 large areas why American interests ranked Israel 8th among the 8 most powerful nations in 2017. We only have a moment left. At the end of the paper, there's a discussion of what Israel's problems are. And lo and behold, the problems are diplomatic. The European diplomatic view of Israel, the view of American liberals, and, to quote the paper, many American Jews are much less sympathetic to Israel today than they've been in the past. Future Israeli leaders may have to think hard about rebuilding links with American Democrats and American Jews. As somebody who grew up as a liberal Jew in New York, take 1 minute. What do you think has to be done for Israel inside America to rebuild or to strengthen once again the tie between American Jews in general and the State of Israel?
You're asking me probably the most difficult question, aside from how do we get peace in the Middle East, and I've got a minute. With that caveat aside, I think the most important thing to understand is that on the one hand, many Americans are more pro-Israel than ever. Many of those people are right-wing Americans, and that's something that the Jewish community has to come to terms with and has to recognize that there may be opportunities to make common cause, at least on the issue of Israel, with some right-wing Americans with whom Jews historically have not had much in common. This is an opportunity, something to think about. It's a conversation that needs to happen. I think as the Holocaust gets further in the past, and as American Jews, as Israel becomes more powerful, frankly, it's no longer the underdog. American Jews historically have liked underdogs. Part of the reason the left around the world supported Israel early on was because Israel was the underdog after the Holocaust. This is all changing. And so I think, unfortunately, it's going to require a lot more than just reassessing sort of left-wing Jews' views towards Israel. It's going to require rethinking what it means to be on the left and how the left thinks about power and thinks about, who is good and who is bad. There's a lot of moral relativism, as I'm sure you talk about on your show. And so, it's a much bigger conversation than just Israel and Jews. It's a conversation about what's going on the left among intellectuals and academics and the kinds of places where many Jews find themselves.
One last question. What are your own career aspirations, Harry? As I meet you through JBS, do you have politics in mind? Where do you see yourself, going?
Yeah, well, look, I think politics is certainly an option. It's difficult, to predict, a career in politics. I think this early in my life, my views have changed a fair amount in the last 10 years. So I can imagine they might change a bit more, although probably somewhat less. And the world is changing. I do think, I feel an urgency to get out there. The world feels darker. One of the things Walter will say is, sometime in the last 5 years, things went from being a post-war world to feeling more like a pre-war world. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, suggests that, young people like me and others need to think seriously about being involved in foreign policy, in politics, because things are getting dangerous and scary, and we can't just, sort of go off and work on whatever seems, fun and interesting for us personally. We have to think bigger.
You're a very impressive, thoughtful individual. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. I hope one day we can sit face-to-face in studio and talk more. In the meantime, I wish you all the best, kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and all the work you do. And if there's any time, another reason I can think to call you on the phone for In the News, we'll do that too. But you be well and keep up the very good work.
Thank you very much.
Be well. Harry Zev Cohn, a research associate at the Hudson Institute, and someone who helped produce a list of the 8 great powers of 2017 for the bi-monthly magazine, The American Interest. And lo and behold, how refreshing is it to read a most positive story about the State of Israel and the way it's making an enormous difference for good, not only in Israel, but for people in Africa, India, Syria. It's a story that every lover of Israel should tell all the time. Israel is now in the top 8 world powers in 2017. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and to the producers of this edition of In the News, Kara Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.